Everyone, welcome back. For those of you who haven't eaten, I'm hoping you've been enjoying the concert we've been putting on for you. A nice restful break in between. It's been a really long but interesting day. So for the next two panels, what I propose to do, what we're proposing to do, is to take a deeper dive into some of the issues we've been touching on so far this morning about policing. And the first part of this session is really looking at what we've been calling the culture change in policing that seems to be necessary. And how do you define that? I mean, there's many easy ways in the media. You know, the blue line, the blue shield, the kind of warrior policing we're used to. We want to go a bit deeper into that, and I think we have assembled a group of really, again, stellar speakers to take us through some of the ins and outs of trying to define policing today. And I want to begin with Professor Thaddeus Johnson, who's just completed a really fascinating report of data points about policing that many of us don't really know about. I mean, we talk a lot about what the landscape of policing is around the country, but there's not a lot of hard data to really tell us what that means and what that involves. So Professor Johnson will start taking us through. He's got a report that he's going to show us, and his bio, the bios of all the speakers are on our website as well, the full bio, and we'll post a shorter bio in the chat room, which we'll see in a second. But Professor Johnson, over to you. Let's start.
Sounds good. Thank you, Steve. You know, I'm always honored and proud to be part of these wonderful and important events that you all hold annually. And I'm looking forward to hearing from my esteemed colleagues on this panel. So I'm going to get in and out so I can sit back and take some notes. And so I just want to share, I'm going to share my screen here. And hopefully everyone can see it well. Okay. So today's presentation kind of pulls from and somewhat extends the Council on Criminal Justice Policing by the Numbers project. I know that we will provide a link for you all to kind of to visit and peruse through. I think it's a wonderful resource, and I'm trying to say that as unbiased as possible. All right. But the project's purpose, now listen, I will provide my 2 cents today and try to contextualize what I may think is going on, or point out some areas that are important for research to kind of figure out what's going on behind the trends. But the project's purpose is not to attribute causation or even correlation, but provide a statistical portrait of key areas, key trends in key areas like police size and composition, police spending, reported crimes and victimization, people killed by the police, and also officers killed in the line of duty, as well as public perceptions and trust in law enforcement. And I'm not going to all that today. That's available in the report, but today I want to kind of focus on the trends reflecting the composition, the complexion, and spending of our U.S. police forces. Now, the caveat is this is national level data, right? So some of your jurisdictions, local trends may be masked by these larger trends, but this paints a portrait of our U.S. police force in its defragmented sense, right? And so these metrics have been included to shed light on the bigger picture of trends in policing and provide a data baseline for these conversations around funding and defunding the police and police size and police resources. And so I'm just going to kind of just jump in right now with a few charts that reflect some of these things. I won't get into all the data that we use, but these are publicly available data sources. But the issue is they're all over the place. We wanted to create a resource for researchers, for John Q. Citizen, for teachers, for journalists, and for practitioners to be able to go to and gravitate to, and then expand from that to kind of have everything in one, nested in one place. So the national level police data comes from BJS data. I won't get into the weeds of things. The crime data that we use for calculations come from the UCR, FBI's Uniform Crime Reports. And the data we use for government spending and police spending comes from the Census Bureau annual survey of local government finances that were compiled by the Urban Institute. Okay, so let's jump in. If you turn your attention to the chart on the left, and mind you, this chart here represents all law enforcement agencies, and that includes sheriffs, states, county, local, all of the above. As we see here, while the number of sworn personnel has increased by over a quarter since 1987. And let me backtrack. We stopped at 2016. That's the most recent data that we have, right? There's a 2020 limits being administered right now, and hopefully we'll get it sometime soon. But there's a couple trends here that I would like to see how it plays out, what shows up in that data as well. So as you see here, while the number has grown across time, that expansion hadn't kept pace with the growth in the general population. And if you turn your attention to the chart on the right, that is the number of sworn law enforcement officers per 1,000 residents. And as we see here, as a result, there were 11 and a half fewer officers per capita in 2016 than there were in 1987. And now, before I move to the next slide, I want you to look at the slide on the left again and look at 2013 and 2016. It was going up the whole time, and then we saw a break and we saw a downtick. Now, I'm not attributing anything to it, but I would be remiss if I didn't point out some of the retention issues and staffing issues that have particularly come up in the last couple of years with these high-profile policing events and issues of public image and mistrust and perceptions of and confidence in the police. And so I think that's a great research question to kind of tease out at some point in the future. Going to the next slide. This is the number of officers per 1,000 Part 1 crimes. And this is often a common metrics used for trying to figure out optimal, even though it's a crude metrics, optimal staffing levels, just one of several. And as we see here, because of the serious decline in Part 1 or felony crimes since the early 1990s, by 2016, we see this large increase. And in fact, the officers per serious crime has nearly doubled from 41 to about 76 and a half officers per Part 1 crime. Now, let's kind of talk about the composition and complexion, for lack of better terms, of our police departments. Now, these are our local police agencies, and part of it was trying to make sure we aligned our data up correctly to make sure that it was accurate, right? And so we didn't include sheriff's agencies or county or state agencies, but as we all know, local police departments make up the overwhelming majority of our law enforcement agencies, and the trends in these areas don't divert too much in those agencies as well. Okay, as you'll see, I probably should have broken it up, but for content and for to not have too many slides, I put the racial and gender demographic on here. And we start with the Black officers with the orange line. The one thing that we will see is that the number and share of Black officers have increased about 60% from 1987 to 2016. And in 2016, even though Black people represent 13% of the general population, they only represent about 11.5% of the police force. Again, the time frame between 2013 and 2016, we see a downtick in the share of Black officers in local police agencies. And again, I'm not attributing anything, but I saw this and I saw the change in size at this point, and it's really got me to thinking as I was preparing this presentation. You'll also see for our Latinx and Hispanic police officers, their share almost quadrupled since 1987. And in 2016, they represent about 12.5% of the police force, local police force. But as we know, they're underrepresented because they make up about 18% of the general population. And when we turn to our female officers, we see that there has been growth, but most of that growth occurred in the 1990s and early 2000s. And really since then, it has remained stagnant for the most part. And I don't have to tell you all, they only represented about 12.3 of the police departments. And the last I checked, women made up much more than that of the general population. And so, as we all know, we have some representation issues when it comes to that. I know we would talk about barriers and challenges to not only staffing in general, but also diversifying our force. And I look forward to having that conversation and maybe unpacking what's behind some of these trends or preventing us from seeing the type of diversification that we all desire and strive for. Now, this is really important, and particularly to me as we talk about the conversation of defunding the police and police funding and the allocation of police resources. And I want to really take my time just briefly to unpack what's going on here. So we went back to 1977 through 2018. And we adjusted for inflation in 2018 dollars to give us a standardized metrics across the board. What you'll see is that police expenditures have increased across time. In fact, spending on police nearly tripled between 1977 and 2018 when adjusting for inflation. Now, mind you, remember the chart that I showed that the number of police officers have grown over time? Well, about research shows that upwards of 80% of police budgets are allocated towards what? Personnel, salaries, benefits. So this really makes sense. And even though you see the period between 13 and 16, even though we saw a decrease in the number of officers, you see the spending continues to go up after a short downturn. And I'm speculating here, but this could reflect increased overtime pay through the staffing shortages or staffing for protests, right? I'm just really trying to pull out these things and love to see some of your ideas about it. But again, a great research question. Or perhaps it just simply represents budgets already locked in from previous collective bargaining agreements. I know we're going to talk about union and some of those things today, so I'm looking forward to even hearing maybe your thoughts about that, because this is intriguing to me. Trying to find out the truth to me is so intriguing. And let me just move on. I don't want to belabor the issue. Now, as expected, police expenditures per capita also increased across time, even though we see some changes in the 2010 and so forth. But for the most part, across times, what we're talking about, this spending per capita close to double. It's about 83% higher in 2018 than it was in 1977. Now, this is the good part to me. This is the total direct and local government expenditures, not just policing. These things include spending on public roadways, education, both K-12 and post-secondary. It includes public spending on public welfare and healthcare and things of that sort, right? We also see that this trend almost mirrors what we saw with the police expenditures. I wonder what that really means. So we look at slide 8. Right, and this is the spending as a share of the total state and local government expenditures. This has relatively remained flat across time, hovering between 3 and 4% of all state and local government expenditures. And so what this says to me is that the total expenditures for other state and functions that I mentioned, public welfare, healthcare, roadways, increases roughly the same rate as the police expenditures have over the past 4 decades. And I think this is really important. And when we're talking about even, and I won't bash with this and I'll move on, but when we start talking about defunding the police, we tend to think about big agencies like NYPD, LAPD, Oakland, or Chicago. They have big budgets, but what about the rest of the other half of agencies that don't have much in their budgets, have 10 officers in there? And they're struggling just as they provide officers' uniforms, right? So we have to think about not only these larger agencies in these conversations, but whether these smaller agencies lie in this conversation as well, which I feel have been really left out. And this is the last slide. I won't go into it because I know we're going to, Steve, talk about it on the back end, but I at least want to just kind of just put the thoughts out there that some of the issues that not only challenge diversifying the force, but staffing the force, the public image of law enforcement, right? Now, how does that impact? Some research shows that it has an impact not only on recruiting and retaining, recruiting and hiring, but also retaining, retirements, turnover, and things of that sort. And we don't think about generational differences. We talk about recruiting, and I won't get into it, but what about the millennial generation? They're like, I'm Generation X, and these are my students, and what they need and want, and things they look for in jobs, and how they look at retirement and things are a lot different. Incentives that are needed are a lot different than it was for me and previous generations. And then we start talking about diversifying the force. There may be some hiring process challenges that presents barriers to certain groups, and I'm just going to stop right there and shut up because I don't want to start delving up to other topics, and I know we're going to come back around to it. But I thought it was a good way to kind of close up and move forward after presenting these set of slides to you all. And I know I kind of moved a little bit fast for the sake of time. But we will provide a link with the full report and description. And with that being said, I will be quiet, and I look forward to hearing the rest of my esteemed colleagues and and their take on their particular topics.
Thanks, Thaddeus, and don't stay quiet. But I want to unpack one of your figures before we go on
Yes.
to Susan. There's a lot of talk about the Clinton generation of cops. These are people who were hired in the mid '90s under the new money being given, thanks to, of course, Joe Biden at that point, to hire a huge number of cops. Most of those cops are now facing retirement, and we're looking at a whole new generation, a whole new landscape. What do your figures tell us about that? Are we looking at a massive departure of a number of police officers around the country over the next 2 to 5 years?
I think that's a very fair take, but I would also say that those persons are also the ones who are in positions of leadership right now as well. And so, and if we want to talk about that generational difference, you know, you want to talk about boomers and millennials, and I just have these conversations, these back and forths. When you say that, it makes me think that maybe even that may present a challenge to hire a new generation of officers. But this is the thing: if we can't make policing attractive to a new generation, we're going to have issues, right? Because this is not as attractive as it once was to even me coming up and older generations, as this is this public service, public servants. It's just really the image is so tarnished right now. The community relations are so strained right now, whether it's, and we can argue about whether that's justifiable or not in many cases, but I do think we will have a gap if we can't figure out how to re-envision law enforcement, the incentive structures that may help change the structure. For instance, my students talk about all the time, what's a big challenge to joining the force? I'm a student loan debt, and I'll need a job that's going to maybe help provide some relief, or besides the public service aspects that's provided. I need a job that may help also if I want to continue my education. And so we need to start moving beyond what we've thought about as far as incentivizing personnel. And I often think about the military. I remember the same type of crisis was coming on when I was growing up, and they started having these commercials and these campaigns, and they made, for lack of better terms, military service sexy again. And we need to somehow figure out how to make law enforcement sexy again to new generations of cohorts, because if not, we will have that gap right there. And so that is a big concern.
That's important to point out. And these figures also tell another interesting and possibly disturbing story. If there are fewer cops per number of people, the number of cops per capita is diminished. That adds a great deal of strain and pressure to the individual cop on the street. I asked Sue Radcliffe to join us. Sue is a mental health clinician with the Dorchester County Health Department in Cambridge, Maryland, and she has done some really interesting work on the impact on mental health and wellness of police. And obviously the figures tell us why it's become a really difficult issue. In fact, probably more difficult than it has been in the past. Sue?
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to be here. I just want to say before I start, I'm having some camera issues, so it goes on and off. So if it goes off, I'm going to keep talking and just get it back on again. Okay. So I first want to start off in talking about health and mental health with just looking at two of my favorite things, data and neuroscience. So first of all, just to recap some of the data with law enforcement, looking at the police side, police on average live a lifespan of about 66, and most of them will only live about 10 years after they retire from the job. Also, the research shows that approximately 1 in 4 police officers have had thoughts of suicide at some time. And compared to other populations, other people in the population, they have a much higher rate of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and also burnout. And the statistic that you never want to hear at a police officer's funeral or wedding is approximately 75% of police marriages end in divorce. So if you look at the correction side of law enforcement, we know that COs, they live to be about 59 years on average, and most of them will only be around for 18 months after they retire. They also have a significant amount of somatic issues, such as back pain, neck pain, high cholesterol, hypertension, that these statistics are higher for police, teachers, and also crisis mental health counselors, which is astounding. Also, research has shown that when they survey correctional officers, 85% of them have seen someone hurt or seriously injured or killed in the workplace. And about half of COs sampled in a study feel that they don't really feel safe coming to work. The one that really gets me, because I'm in public health, and of course everything is with the COVID virus, is that a suicide's risk of suicide is 39% higher than the average of other professions combined. I know for us, when we have a 2% tick in COVID cases, we go nuts. 39% is just crazy. We also know that there's quite a mental health stigma with law enforcement. And I know one of the local law enforcement told me, I don't want to go get any help because I don't want to have my gun taken away. So we look at this, and we look at also PTSD stats, where we have about 7 to 8% of the general population have PTSD. And depending on the study you look at, 7 to 19% of police officers have PTSD. And in a study of about 3,000 COs, 27% met the diagnostic criteria. So this is crazy. What is happening here? We're putting all these demands on law enforcement, and especially what Dr. Johnson just said with all the information on the defunding of the police, but what are we doing as far as to look at helping them? And I think we really need to look at the brain. In particular, we need to look at the limbic system of the brain. Now, that is your emotional center of the brain. Starts off with a part of the brain called the amygdala, and that's your uh-oh. So if you think about it, most officers and correctional officers have a lot of uh-ohs during the day. When you have that uh-oh, it sends a message to another part of your brain, your hypothalamus, to get you jacked up. So it starts your heart rate going, blood pressure, getting ready for a response, and getting ready for a threat. So that then sends a message to the pituitary gland, hey, we need to jack this stuff up a little more because a threat's coming at you and you need to be safe. So let's start excreting adrenaline and cortisol. Now, those are great things. I know when I used to live in Manhattan, I'd be walking across the street, I'd see a car coming at me, I'd go, uh-oh, it'd give me all this energy, I could run to the side, and then, whew, I relax. But when we're looking at law enforcement, they don't get a little break on their uh-ohs. They are all on their uh-ohs all the time. So consequently, what happens week after week, year after year, is that the cortisol that's secreting eats away at your brain. So if it eats at your amygdala and your hypothalamus and your pituitary, you're going to be jacked up and hypervigilant all the time, always looking over your back. Where's the threat? When it eats at a part of your brain called the hippocampus, that's the part where you learn, you have memories, you record and you retrieve memories. A good example is you could be sitting in your living room, you hear a big bang, your kid just knocked something over, and then mentally you are back where you were, a day ago in a gun shootout or something horrible that happened at work. Because of the damage of the brain, you can't differentiate, okay, wait a minute, where am I? When we look at the damage that cortisol has done to your thalamus, that's your emotional relay station. And I hear this mostly from the officers in my community, is that when they go home, they'll say something and their wife will say, or husband will say, why are you talking to me like that? Why are you coming out with that tone? They're like, what do you mean? Yeah. That's also the part of the brain that deals with all your senses except for the sense of smell. So this has huge implications if we want to change the culture of corrections, just because if you're not seeing things right and hearing everything as a threat, it's going to be really hard to connect with your community. Lastly, the last part of the limbic system that the cortisol eats is your frontal lobe. And this is the part of the brain where you put behaviors and consequences together. It also helps you with foresight and planning. And if this part of the brain is damaged from the excessive cortisol due to the job stress, boy, you're going to have a hard time. You're not going to be able to think on your feet, to know that, oh, if I do this, then this will happen. Or if I say this, this will happen. Also, when you are all up in your uh-ohs, all that energy is being focused to the amygdala. So you can't think right. And that's where I know I put it in the article, Stephen, that was on the crime report. That's when cell phones can look like guns. Yeah, because you're so used to the threat. I know that in listening to the panelists earlier today, one of the things that Connie Rice had said is that law enforcement are feeling under attack. And they certainly are. And if we're, to swing it back around to what Dr. Johnson said, if we are going to bring sex back, we first have to look at a culture of how are we taking care of our officers and how do we take care of their brains first. So
thank you, Sue.
I'll stop.
No, thank you. That really puts a lot of human stories on the data that we've been talking about. I mean, I think we know that. We know the difficulties and the trauma that police officers experience, but seeing them depicted graphically as you did, it's really traumatic. And the logical question after that is, how do you train officers for that? I mean, what, much less getting them in the door, but to train them to deal with those kinds of issues, plus their normal law enforcement, has to be an uphill battle now. And Alex Carmen has trained thousands of police officers, including all the Texas police chiefs. He's a professor and associate dean at the College of Liberal and Fine Arts at Tarleton State University. And he's probably the best person we should ask in the nation right now to talk about where does training go? How do you train a new generation of policing, given the new climate, the new atmosphere, and the special stresses that that police have to face today?
Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, everyone. And it's great to hear my colleagues talk about some of those interesting and incredibly important topics related to training. So one of the things that we think about when you think about training is it the same thing as education, right? Are you providing an education to law enforcement versus training? And we find out, and we have found recently in the past couple of years, that whenever we've had issues such as the death of George Floyd, Tatiana Jefferson, and various other national profile killings, it always goes back to the concept of training, and meaning how we really train law enforcement in an effective manner, how we train police officers to face the brutality of their daily activities, and then also the threat, right, not only to their lives, but the lives of bystanders. One of the things that I've argued for years now is that it's not just the training, but it's also the recruitment piece. And Dr. Johnson, talked a little bit about that. I as someone that has trained, as Steve said, thousands of police officers in the course of 23 years, I can tell you that there are folks that are trainable and there are individuals that are not. If you bring to the police academy individuals that really do not understand the concept of the U.S. Constitution, its application, the complexities with law enforcement, I don't care what type of training you're going to put at the academy, or whether or not all of your trainers are incredibly well certified and regarded. At the end of the day, it's an impossibility. It's an impossible task to train someone that does not have the aptitude and, more importantly, the desire to be trained, right? So, and unfortunately, in the law enforcement profession, the FBI tells us that we have over 1 million police officers in the streets today. Most of are honest, decent, hardworking people, but we find ourselves with a population of individuals that are attracted to the job that should have never actually gone through the ranks of a police academy, much less ever been recruited. When is the last time that any of us had a conversation nationally about blaming the police recruiter and the police academy in the failure of what happens in the streets, in terms of law enforcement? We never do. It always goes back to the chief. It always goes back to the institutional components, but it seldom goes back to that training component. And having trained, having talked to and engaged with thousands of police agencies across the United States, I can tell you all that the biggest concern for us is that the bottom line is the budgets for these entities, for the training component and the recruitment component, are ridiculously low. And so while the agencies are emphasizing salaries and capturing other components to make the law enforcement profession a little bit less threatening and more attractive to that 21-year-old millennial getting out of school, at the end of the day, when you look at how much money they actually invest in recruitment, It is ridiculous. You have one recruiter in a mid-sized to large agency in the United States, and we expect the recruiting class to look like the individuals that they serve, which is in itself an impossibility, right? Because then we get into the business of tokenism, and it goes down that rabbit hole that no one wants to talk about, right? So what does that training look like? And I'll go back to what Sue said earlier, which I think is very, very important. When we talk about the brain, and I've always said that the training part is always featured from what is the trendy topic, right? Anyone in law enforcement will tell you that some of the concepts that we're quote unquote introducing right now were introduced 25, 30 years ago. We just call them something different today, right? And now it has an app, where 30 years ago that did not exist. But at the end of the day, when you look at what the brain does, the brain of a millennial is trained, and the science tells us this, is trained to capture 30-second snippets. And here we are, the rest of us in our 50s, training at police academies with memos and books and large volume of documents. These millennials do not understand that concept. They're going to sit there and either look for the quote unquote Reader's Digest version. And if you found that to be relevant, then you are from my generation. For most of my students, when I teach this, they Google automatically what the Reader's Digest version means of anything, right? But if you look at the Reader's Digest version of what they just want to know the bottom line. They want to understand the structure. They want to understand the yeses and the nos, not the maybes. Most of our policies are based on maybes. Most of our policies are guidelines. They're never yeses or nos. And so we are having a problem, if you really dissect what's going on in police training, is that we are teaching with the wrong tools, these very, very bright individuals that are technologically savvy, but don't know what they don't know. And so the bottom line is that we go back to training and we say, okay, so we have amazing policies. I have encountered in my career, amazing police departments with wonderfully written policies. But at the end of the day, are we training the officers on those policies, and are we holding them accountable for how they follow those policies? And I believe in my heart of hearts that in the next 8 to 10 years, we are going to see a radical change in some of our training curricula. We are going to see that some of these instructors are going to be better equipped. They're going to have the ability of being able to communicate for something that you touched on earlier, Steve, which was your question about folks retiring now. And I think that these individuals that are at police academies, that are instructors, that have been there forever, are now leaving. And now a new cadre, a new type of individual instructor is coming in, one that perhaps is more technologically savvy, one that perhaps is shorter in the discussions, but perhaps more pointed in some of those critical areas, i.e. use of force, racial profiling, and the interactions with the public that are so critical to our profession today. And finally, I leave it with this. I think it's really important to bring science to the training component. And what I mean by that is we need to conduct a training gap analysis across the board. We need to figure out exactly what in the training is lacking right now and what are the good training trends. As I've traveled the United States and talked to a lot of training coordinators across the US, I have found that many of them, they offer what is required by the state as part of their in-service training. And then that 20 or 30% gap in their training curricula is something that is quote unquote trendy, right? So how to write good reports, because somehow this is a deficit. Well, it's been a deficit for 30 years. Now, all of a sudden, you just got to fill that 3-hour block with your neighbor next door who just retired as a cop, who is all of a sudden certified to teach the class. But at the end of the day, what we don't really understand is the quality of that training needs to, that 20% or 30% gap outside of what your state requires is something that is very, very important to fill with not only what's going on right now, but what will likely happen in the next 5 to 10 years. Just imagine that police department 3 years ago that trained on how to handle immunological diseases and crowd control. What a foresight that police department would have had to face COVID-19. Think about where we were last year in January versus where we are now, and how police departments, had we had the foresight of at least understanding what was going on internationally in October, November, and December relevant to COVID-19, how better prepared we would have all been. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Alex. There's a lot to deconstruct there, but just I want to press you on one thing. If you widen the lens a bit, part of the issue has always been, if you go into whatever profession you go into, if you're looking at college or if you're a high school student, is the standing professions have in the American public. Right? This is something that's worthwhile. This gives you status. This doesn't give you status. It's a bit like teaching. Teaching has a certain amount of status, but it's low pay. And you're not going to let a lot of people who are young people who would rather go to Silicon Valley, let's say, than teach in a local high school. I was reading a interview the other day with through the Police Executive Research Forum with a police chief who started out as a stockbroker and decided, you know, I really would like to give back into public service, and she became a police chief. There's not a lot of that. Is it one of the problems that we have is our society does not look at police or the work of law enforcement as something that's a high status profession compared to, say, a lawyer or a stockbroker, or dare I say it, even a journalist?
Yeah, I was going to joke with you and ask you if that police chief that used to be a stockbroker, if he decided to join the police force when the stock market crashed, or if it was actually during the good days after he had made enough money. But in all seriousness, if you look back at the past 100 years or even 70 years in law enforcement in the United States, law enforcement as a profession was actually used by many first-generation immigrants as a way to empower themselves, right? So like if you look at the Irish coming into New York and Boston, I mean, now we have 3-4 generations of Irish Americans that have been in law enforcement. They used it as an empowerment trend. You look at places like Miami, like Houston, a lot of us first-generation immigrants like myself coming from Latin America have used law enforcement as a method to empower ourselves. And that's why you see a great fluctuation of Latinx folks coming into law enforcement. Having said all that, I think now what we face is the social media negativity that has been portrayed on law enforcement, the fact that it is a low-paying job, the fact that it is a risky job, and the fact that the perception is that it's riskier than what it actually is. And so by virtue of that, you have a 21-year-old, and I see this at my university all the time, that I wear both hats, that of a consultant and that of a university administrator and professor. And I see this all the time when our 21-year-olds that are very talented, very bright, very skilled, choose another profession because their family members are telling them, why in the world would you want to be a cop today? Why in the world would you want to end up like so-and-so that was just featured in the news locally a couple of days ago? Do you want to start your career getting paid 1/3, as to your point, versus what somebody else would make in the industry? And those that go into law enforcement go the federal route. Because when is the last time you saw an FBI agent getting indicted on a use of force shooting, right? So at the end of the day, they see it as a safer venue, more prestigious, love the idea of joining the FBI, and many of them actually feel that it's a better job than say local law enforcement. I fear for our communities 10 years down the road as to where we're going to be and what kind of incentives we're going to be able to offer young people to convince them to come into law enforcement.
So the logical question is, what do we do as a nation, as a society, as individual cities to make it more attractive? And obviously unions have a huge role in that. The easy take is that unions have been a barrier to a lot of the changes and transformations we've been talking about throughout the day. That's not the case in Wisconsin, I'm glad to say, where Jim Palmer is president of the Wisconsin, executive director of the Wisconsin Professional Police Association. He's been a leader in really transforming the idea of police and law enforcement, and making the union a collaborator and a partner in real reforms. And I know there are lots of others out there around the country, but Jim is one of the most interesting ones. So, Jim, I want to hand it over to you to talk a little bit about the role of the unions, where you see the profession going, and how unions, perhaps in other places around the country, can step up to the challenge.
Absolutely, and I'm just honored to be here and humbled by this wonderful panel, and it's a hard act to follow for sure. But so I'll strive for brevity so we can get to discussion. But I think when we talk about changing the landscape and the culture relative to policing in America, and affecting changes and reimagining policing, I think law enforcement unions can play a vital role in that process. Now, they can either help promote it and support it, or frustrate it. And I think, by and large, and I've said this in other contexts, I don't think law enforcement unions generally have been very constructive contributors to the public discourse that surrounds policing in America. And that's not to say by any means that our organization has figured it out, but I do think that we have taken a very different approach in how we engage the public on these issues. I think when you look around the country, it's very common for law enforcement unions to be very reactive, and it's very rare to find a police organization that maintains a consistent communication strategy. I think I often lament the fact that there aren't more police unions, especially in the wake of a controversial incident, speaking out on some of these issues. And then in many cases, when they do, I wish they hadn't. I think, the FOP local union leader following the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and he was facing a lot of tough questions and scrutiny at a press conference at their headquarters, and he referred to the scrutiny as a lynching, and it just exemplified a certain degree of tone deafness that I think was not helpful at all. And there is also, I think, this desire amongst many in law enforcement, because they do feel that they're under attack, to maybe be defensive and to be combative. And I don't think that's constructive. It doesn't advance the dialogue in any meaningful way. And I think it just places the law enforcement community at a further disadvantage when we're talking about potential changes. I remember Ron DeLorde speaking a number of years ago at our annual convention, and he repeated a colloquialism: if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. And I think it's important for law enforcement unions to play a more constructive role in the discourse. Some of the things that we do in our state that I think are unique, and we're actually in our 9th year now. We've commissioned an annual statewide poll through the St. Norbert College Strategic Research Institute on a wide variety of issues related to policing, criminal justice, we identify the areas in which we'd like to gauge public perception, but we allow the scientists, the experts, to craft those questions. We're not trying to derive a certain outcome. And then we use those results, that data, to go around the state and use it as a platform to play a more assertive role in the public dialogue that surrounds policing. Try and highlight, and that means sometimes acknowledging and highlighting, some of the things that maybe don't reflect well on law enforcement officers. I think there's
certainly been no lack of controversial incidents in Wisconsin that we know of. But what is it about Wisconsin or Wisconsin officers that change? I mean, why is it that you see less of that pushback in Wisconsin than you would see in other places? What's the magic? What's the secret sauce that you guys have brought to the table?
That's a good question, and I don't know that I have an. I think I don't know that I have a good answer for that. And as we saw following the controversial shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, we still very much are criticized, law enforcement in general. We just decided that we wanted to play a more assertive and active role in the dialogue, and highlight the difference in perceptions that people have, based on their ethnicity and their race and the size of community they live in. And when we talk about reimagining policing, we've spent a lot of time asking a variety of series of questions over the years about what people want in their law enforcement. They want more officers in their neighborhoods, less. We ask them a series of questions about community policing. And, just as one example, we have found a pretty significant, community policing in general is very popular. Of course, that's, I'm sure, no surprise. But it's a much bigger, there's much more support amongst minority communities in community policing. And when we ask them, do you want more officers in your neighborhood, less, they want it kept the same, minority respondents tend to say they want more officers. And so when we read the different the results to the different questions together, it does seem, according to our research, that communities of color want more officers in their neighborhoods, not less, but they're telling us what kind of policing they want. They don't want just boots on the ground. They want officers who foster those relationships and get to know them and their issues. And we think that's instructive. And so those are just some of the things that we've done that I think have helped us. Obviously, law enforcement is still going to bear the brunt of some amount of criticism, right or wrong. And, we are not, we have intentionally stayed away from, talking about Blue Lives Matter. And I think we spent a lot of time reaching out and trying to engage communities of color to specifically have a better understanding of their perception. Whether we agree with it or not, I think it's important to understand that how people see our members and see the law enforcement profession, and recognize that, you know, those perceptions are based on experiences that are unique to them and their own set of lens. And I think that has helped us foster some relationships that I think are meaningful and that will help not only advance the law enforcement profession in Wisconsin, but also the communities that our officers serve. Just one other point I wanted to make, so we can move along to the discussion is, you know, Dr. Johnson, I thought your presentation was outstanding, and you mentioned, you know, I think some of the data was from 2016, crime data, perhaps it was. You know, when we talk about data and what the landscape currently is in this country, and what we know, I almost think it's as interesting or frustrating what we don't know. And there is just such a dearth of information in so many areas. You know, a lot of states, we have proposals that have been introduced in Wisconsin as well, are considering legislation to eliminate the use of no-knock warrants. And just in my state, and I'm confident we're not unique in this regard, there isn't a single person that can tell you how often they're used and what their outcomes are. And so, you know, I have a little bit of a frustration or hesitancy or concern about making public policy decisions based on a tragic and horrific outcome in Louisville, Kentucky, following obviously the death of Breonna Taylor. And that's just one example. We talk about mental health and policing. You know, Wisconsin has 72 counties. Each county will have a different mental health facility. They're all licensed differently, so they can't take the same type of individuals that are suffering in a mental health crisis. And there isn't anyone that can tell you how those agencies are licensed. We don't have a single cumulative list. I'm sure we could put one together, but the fact that that doesn't exist right now is a little bit startling. With regard to law enforcement use of force, 9 years ago, we began our organization began collecting and publicly reporting data relative to officer-involved shootings. And as hard as this may be to believe, we were the first and only entity to collect and report this data publicly then, and that is just as true today. That shouldn't be the case. And we started collecting it because, you know, how do you have an informed dialogue when you don't have the information? And so we wanted to endeavor to collect that. And again, I think that has helped contribute to
Jim, let me push you a bit. Let me push you a bit further. I think when we discuss transforming the police, I think we can't really do that unless you really transform the role of labor unions, police labor unions. And that's what I want to do, sort of concentrate on a little bit with you. I mean, you're a labor union, you think about conditions of work, you think about salaries, but you also unusually and uniquely are involved in disciplining, in policy making and policy suggestions. That's two hats you wear in many ways. How do you square that? And what really should police unions be? Should police unions be collaborators or partners, or should they retain the classic labor union stance of being against management and fighting management because it's a zero-sum game? You know, what management wins, we lose.
Well, I think, you know, and maybe I'm naive, I believe both can be done. I believe you can be an advocate and still stand up for the due process rights of individual officers facing disciplinary scrutiny. You know, I think one thing that, you know, law enforcement unions, police unions have a vital role to play to make sure that, you know, management, when they discipline officers, that they're doing it using, you know, the appropriate steps. I think it's also critically important for every union to make a better point of explaining that, listen, we're not in the business of protecting bad apples. And I think that's one of the things that I hear most frequently. And, you know, I probably at least once a month have to respond to a media story that involves, you know, bad examples of cases where arbitration was used to protect a bad officer in some other state. We haven't had an arbitration in the last 5 years. We do have that right. But we also have police and fire commissions in Wisconsin, a civilian oversight, and we've had it for over 100 years. So we're, you know, maybe going back to your question, Steve, about what makes Wisconsin unique. In some respects, it's historical, and so I can't take any credit for that. But I think law enforcement unions have to kind of break out of this advocacy silo, if you will, of issues that, wages, hours, and conditions of employment. Those are all important. But at the same time, I think you have to look beyond that, and whether you're looking at thinking about in terms of a collective bargaining agreement, or what a group may lobby for or against at its state capitol or before Congress.
When you meet your counterparts in other states, do they think you're wild and woolly and over liberal for their taste, or do you see anybody actually in that sort of same thought?
There are some. I mean, generally, I think the response is that we're a little off, and I'll let you be the judge of that. I'm not saying that they're wrong, but I asked my counterparts in different states, what are they seeing with officer-involved shootings, and they don't know, and they don't really, for the most part, haven't expressed much of a desire to find out. But when I talk about, we represent officers involved in critical incidents such as officer-involved shootings, and our general approach is to facilitate the officers' voluntary cooperation with those investigations. When I explain that to my counterparts around the country, they think that that's just absolutely insane. Wisconsin in 2014 became the first state in the nation to mandate the independent and outside investigations of every officer-involved death, and we were a leading advocate of that measure. In conjunction with citizen advocates. I worked very closely with a gentleman whose son had been shot by police officers in Kenosha, coincidentally, in 2004. And he won a settlement as a result of a civil lawsuit, and used that to kind of start a public campaign. And then we came together, I think, in 2013. And started working alongside one another. And I think we showed that sometimes you can have unnatural partners come together and do things that are mutually beneficial.
Well, let me maybe start off the conversation with a general question to all of you, repeating a question I asked at the earlier panel, that what the role of the federal government should be. I mean, there's been talk about national certification, national standards. There's been talk about creating a national database of police officers who've been fired or disciplined, so people know what they are. I mean, these are ideas that sort of bring together a lot of the issues we've been talking about that have been flaws in policing as one way of transforming them. On the negative side, we don't have a national police force. We're not that kind of country. So I wonder if you could, each of you in your own ways, maybe could comment on where you think the right balance is between the national approach to policing and giving states and municipalities the right to decide how they want their police to be. Maybe Thaddeus, as a ex-law enforcement yourself, maybe you want to start off the responses.
Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit different approach. Oftentimes we give the federal government credit for being innovators when that's often not the case. We saw that with the 1994 crime bill, that they got the credit for the crime bill when actually states were moving in that direction, and they rewarded states for having strategies that align with their own philosophy. So let me point that out, right? And so the federal government hadn't really had a great track record when it comes to involvement with law enforcement, talk about consent decrees, all these things. That's the whole thing. I think the biggest issue, and this is maybe where the federal government can come in, is helping with incentives. And we often forget that policing is a public service, but it's not just benevolent, it's a job, right? It's an industry, it's a public service industry. And so if we recruit the right officers, if we train the right officers, we need to make sure that all those things align with how we're rewarding our officers. Now, let me say this, as an officer, I made arrests. Oftentimes was convoluted of whether I'm doing this for public safety or I'm doing this because it's my job to do so, and how does that impact my discretion? So imagine if I was incentivized and rewarded for community engagement, and that was deemed just as important as conditional crime control. And so officers tend to be policy compliant. When you see officers misbehave, it's more than just that officer. It's a culture of what we talked about, right? It's a training, it's those things, it's a supervision, it's the recruitment, but it's also how we incentivize. So can you imagine a world to where an officer can be credited for making a traffic stop for public safety, your tail lights out? not to give you a ticket, but do you need me to trail you home? We wanted to make sure that you were safe. You still get credited for making the contact, but it's not punitive. And what is the impact on the actual citizens? What is the impact on those perceptions that we take that approach? So perhaps the federal government can help us transform the incentive structure and make investments, particularly in these smaller agencies where we can really reward officers for community engagement. And we talk about recruitment and bringing that in and bring it full circle. Perhaps look, Black officers, women officers, millennial officers tend to join things for different reasons, right? And not necessarily for crime fighting. Also, if we don't reward officers based on their skill set, but we reward them, we create disparities within our rank structure, promotions for women and people of color. So we create these inequities. So perhaps the federal government can be involved with incentives or what have you to help incentivize the type of policing that we want. So we can have always the need for armed guardianship, or structural inequities that create crime. You're going to need that. But what about the other 80% of the job that's not crime fighting? I never knew of an efficient and successful business that rewarded employees based on 20% of the job, right? And so if that's the case, perhaps the federal government can help local agencies incentivize officers in ways that actually align with our new vision for policing. So that may be my innovative or my outside the box take on the federal government's role.
Thank you. Sue, we have a Veterans Administration who deals with the military, particularly dealing with PTSD, with trauma, with injuries. Should we have a national body or national institution dealing with trauma, the mental health and wellness of police officers or law enforcement in general?
I think that's definitely something that could be looked at for the future and for all the journalists out there. Because one of the things that I have not been able to find is there any research or is there anybody looking at what is the history of what's going on with the brains of these officers that are in the spotlight right now? I mean, we know that the job is unbelievably difficult and it's stressful, but there's not a lot out there on, okay, yeah, well, what was going on with this officer? How many years had they been on the force? You know, how many overtime days have they had in the month? And what are, you know, our national standards as far as looking at wellness and especially brain wellness for those of that are on the front lines? I think that that's something that it's a great question, and would love to see a solution with that as far as with their wellness.
Just over to you, Alex. Again, should there be national standards for training officers, or do we have to? Does each state, each municipality, each police agency really deal with, you know, its particular issues on its own? Obviously, conditions are different between a police agency or a sheriff's department in Iowa and New York City. But what prevents us from having some sort of national certification standards that would apply everywhere?
And the answer, and I hate to be an academic about this, Steve, is both, right? Because there is room for the federal government in some of these matters, but there's also obviously, remember, I reside in the Lone Star state of Texas. And so we're very proud here of being, you know, very much the Lone Star for a reason. And what I mean by that is the fact that I think a lot of states feel, and rightly so, they feel like their problems are unique to themselves. A lot of jurisdictions are, and therefore the federal government does not need to mingle in their regards. So I think, for instance, definitions and use of force, exactly what those parameters are, those things are definitely worthy of discussion. While at the same time, I think the governance and the standards of the various training components should be localized and remain that way. You know, I've had the unique opportunity of working as a federal monitor in two of the largest consent decrees in the United States, and currently work as a special master on the Puerto Rico consent decree, working for the federal judge there. And I can tell you that there is a time, and he convinced me. I was not convinced at the time that I embraced in this journey 7 years ago, but it did convince me that there are police departments, albeit a few, that really would benefit rather from a federal intervention as it relates to best practices. While at the same time,
what about general issues that could be legislated federally? Let's take qualified immunity. People are now talking about that in individual states about removing it. It's an issue that unions, of course, in many states or many cities are opposing. How do you all feel about that issue of qualified immunity? And whoever Speak out, whoever wants to talk about it.
It's a terrible idea, Steve. I can tell you that right now.
Removing it or
Yeah, removing it. Look, if you already have a hard time trying to find police officers that are going to come, or individuals that are going to come into law enforcement, I cannot imagine what it's like to be paid $50,000 a year. All the stressors of a job, have the highest level of alcoholism and divorce rate out of any other profession, highest level of suicide, and then add to that the fact that you may lose everything you ever owned as a result of police action related to what you did. Seriously, I mean, we got to have serious conversations, and in my view, at the national spectrum, but that's not one of them.
anybody else? Jim?
I agree. I do think that there's so much of the discussion surrounding qualified immunity has been we should have it or we shouldn't, and I don't. I think where it gets complicated is that I think there are some reasonable criticisms that it has been applied in cases to because the court said, well, the facts in this case weren't identical to the facts in a case that was previously decided, and I think those are the cases that people can trot out and say, well, this is why we need to eliminate it. And I think it might be worth exploring whether there can be some legislative changes to allow courts to exercise a little bit more flexibility. But I think doing away with it in its entirety would be just devastating to law enforcement officers, to municipalities, and to the profession, and to public safety. I mean, I was just in Wisconsin. We have a task force that's been established to explore and examine the issue of racial disparities, particularly in law enforcement. And we had a city attorney from the Milwaukee area come and provide a presentation to the group, and he said, listen, if qualified immunity went away, we would tell officers to stop policing. Respond to emergencies maybe, but as far as anything beyond that, I mean, there's just it would be an absurd liability, and we wouldn't do it.
Thaddeus, Sue, any ideas, thoughts on that?
I honestly don't think I'm a qualified person to respond to that. so I'll leave it to my colleagues on the panel.
Thaddeus, how's what you're feeling about that?
I mean, I agree with both Alex and Jim. Like, I don't really have much additional to add to that, because I can't imagine, the purpose for it is good, right? We do vigorously enforce the law and hold it upright, right? So it's an important tool, just like we see with prosecutors and all these things. And as Alex said, as rough as it is already, the low pay and what's at stake, it's really it's a stake for not for something that's misconduct, but it could be a lapse of judgment. And so I think it's an important tool, and without that, it will be even harder to recruit officers and things of this sort. So I absolutely agree with my colleagues.
So we've got a lot of questions coming up. There's one more issue I'd just like to address, and some of the questions actually go to that as well. We've been talking about culture change. And we'll get into a little bit more of that into the next session. But, for a long time, policing has been a warrior profession. I mean, that's what people think about, the SWAT teams. We see it on TV. It's militarized in many ways, and many of the cops who join come from the military to begin with. Do you folks think that that's a problem that needs to be addressed, or is it something that will fade out with the new generation? Are we over-militarized? Do we need to demilitarize our police in some way? Whoever wants to start out is welcome to start.
So I don't have to break the pattern. I'll go ahead and start, Steve. I will say that it's been an interesting debate for the past few years as to what is necessary and what should law enforcement have in terms of weaponry. While on the one hand, I understand this is a civilian component in our communities. On the other hand, as a criminologist and putting on my criminology hat on, there's some really, really bad actors out there that are carrying some serious weapons that are trying to destruct and destroy, our way of life. And whether that's domestic terrorism or international terrorism, or just the average, criminal. But the bottom line is that oftentimes, as we saw a few weeks ago or a few months ago in Miami, where those FBI agents were killed, a man and a woman, and a third one hospitalized severely. Law enforcement is constantly, in the line of danger. And if we start restricting our law enforcement community from the type of weapons that they'll have for a particular operation, that certainly will not be the case among those that are on the other side of the law. They will have no restrictions. And so we're gonna send these individuals to the line of fire, poorly equipped, with very limited funding on already a difficult circumstance. I think it's a terrible idea. I think we should let the local communities determine what is enough and what is sufficient based on crime patterns and based on the level of threat, based on threat assessments, because New York City is going to have a very different threat level than a local rural community in Wisconsin, right? So at the end of the day, we have to be able to give them the tools that they need to do their job.
Thank you. Jim, demilitarization?
I don't know if I can add more than that, because I agree with everything Alex said. I think, one of the things that we forget, is especially as it relates to law enforcement's use of military equipment, is that, I think there was increasing pressure on law enforcement because of budgetary challenges and things of that nature for them to avail themselves and seize those opportunities to utilize the benefits of the 1033 program and then because the agencies were forced to do so, I think it's held against them unfairly, and it is something that locally, Alex said it perfectly. I can't improve upon that. That's something that locally should be decided, and it's something that is responsive to the needs, law enforcement needs of that particular area.
Let me go to some of the questions now that are on our board. Here's a really more specific one from Eddie Burkhalter of Alabama Reporter, who says that very little training is given to Alabama police officers during a certification on how to deal with those suffering from mental illnesses. So what do you all see with respect to such training nationwide? Again, this goes to Sue's, the question I posed to Sue about nationwide training and nationwide help in terms of mental illness. This is on the other side of it, to deal with people who are suffering mental issues.
I'll jump in if I may. I think it's an issue of national concern that the federal government should support additional mental health training, crisis intervention training, as well as, community policing strategies. I mentioned earlier, referred to our polling effort. We have seen for a fact that communities of color have a unique preference, a significant preference for community policing. And if the idea is to strengthen the relationship between law enforcement agencies and the communities they serve, that's perhaps the best way to reimagine policing. I think, we talk about defunding policing, it takes funding, law enforcement has some core functions, and responding to calls for service is obviously most prominent among them. You start defunding agencies and implementing significant reductions in their budgets. Community policing strategies and problem solving strategies are the programs that suffer. I think that's very counterproductive. I do think that when it comes to mental health issues involving law enforcement and their response, that the federal government does have a role and should play a larger role in providing that training and those resources to agencies across the country.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I'll just kind of jump in and just really piggybacking on that. Like, again, if we talk about the militarization, we focus so much on the equipment that the militarization is a mindset. It's not about the equipment, right? It's a mindset. And so I think about the same thing with the mental health training. I'm not sure the training that's out there, but I remember going through the academy. I got tons of training on deadly force, tons of training on officer survival. I don't remember any de-escalation training. I don't remember. I remember watching child abuse training. It was a tape from the 1970s, a VHS tape that they throw on 80s, right? And they throw on. I think we focus also too much on the academy training. And what about in-service training? Yep. In-service is just a throwaway. It's a vacation for officers. We need to make in-service training matter. And even you talk about the field training officers. To me, that's a key component. Right there is a training of the trainers that we don't talk about these things. And I don't want to keep talking about that all these things don't matter if we don't incentivize officers correctly. But if you give me mental health training, but at the end of the day, I'm coming on scene to make an arrest, and that's my mindset. Just like with places that got preferred and mandatory domestic violence in the policies, they're not going there to de-escalate. they're in the back of their mind, they're using their police skills based on their training and the reward structure to make an arrest. And when you go into situations like that, regardless of what training you get, it's bound to have see some of the things that we see on the media. And so that's just kind of my 3 cents now on that.
Alex, is there a format that you use in terms of mental health training when you're dealing with your officers?
Yeah, so we actually have, as Jim pointed out, there are some national standards and some national resources that we use. We have what's called the CIT certification for our law enforcement officers that essentially, you know, and we actually don't only look at the quality of the training, but we look at the ratio of CIT trained officers versus the needs and the calls for service as it relates to CIT stuff. Part of the problem that we've had for years is that when officers show up at the scene, sometimes they don't even know that they're dealing with a mental health issue, right? So the idea is to not necessarily prepare them to be counselors or a psychiatrist or therapists, but rather to help them identify those signs so that they can look for the appropriate resources on the spot, as opposed to escalate the issue, you know, as Dr. Johnson mentioned, and kind of take it up to the next level. So yes, we have resources. The training component is improving tremendously, because this has been part of the national conversation now for the past 3 years. And it hasn't been politicized to the extent that one side of the spectrum feels one way versus another. I think there's some degree of unity and agreement abroad, across the aisle, that this is an important and critical issue. My only concern is that we're not doing it at a pace that keeps up with the times, right? And especially now, keep this in mind, we've got COVID now. We're going to have at some point the post-COVID era, which right now everyone is on that fight and flight syndrome as it relates to surviving our everyday and looking at our loved ones, making sure they're protected, vaccinated, et cetera. But at some point when this COVID spectrum ends, we are going to be dealing with massive amounts of individuals with mental health issues that are having them now, that are going to exhibit them then. And are we as a law enforcement profession ready to deal with that tsunami that is going to come our way, not years from now, but perhaps months from now?
Good point. Sue, this is an issue that's very much in your ballpark.
Yeah, I really resonate with what Thaddeus said about how when you come on a scene, what you're getting, and you're kind of like ready for it. And if you think about it from a neurobiological perspective, we're asking officers to come to a scene where they don't really know, what the background is, and be ready, but then also be ready to be kind. That's a lot for your brain. And it's almost impossible. And one of the things I know that I'm glad Alex mentioned about CIT training is that when I became the trainer for it, I was kind of surprised that like one of the first things you do when you come on a scene is you have to say, you rehearse and you role play, telling them your name and asking them what their name is. And now that I know more information about what's happened to your brain, is that you need something to kind of take a shift to like, ooh, okay, let me find out what's going on first, and let me, assess the threat, instead of just going in and ready to be hands-on.
Thaddeus mentioned domestic abuse as really being insufficient the way he was trained, but we know that domestic abuse calls are one of the key drivers of officer deaths. It's one of the most tragic and sensitive issues that officers can walk into. That's a real failing. There hasn't been much training or much education, as far as I can tell, in terms of dealing with domestic abuse cases and domestic abuse survivors. Anyone want to comment on that? Does that be part of it's an issue that unions should be worried about, I assume, as well, Jim, but anyone is welcome to speak on that. I guess you all agree. Alex, is domestic abuse again part of your curriculum?
It is, and we benefit in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We have a rather large center that was put together by the Bass family. It is a center that allows for victims of domestic violence to seek refuge, and it's quite innovative and nationally well known. And so our law enforcement officers work very, very closely with the therapists, with the counselors, with the judges in that regard. But obviously, we all know, those of us that have been studying or being part of policing for, a couple of decades here, one of the things that we know is that is one of the most dangerous calls that a police officer can respond to. And so to that end, they have to be trained accordingly or else.
So a question for Jim from Rebecca Tan of the Washington Post, who asked whether it says many states have law enforcement bills of rights, which, according to advocates and lawmakers, may impede police accountability. So where do you stand on that? Is that something that your union favors?
Well, it'll probably come as no surprise. We support that officers have some basic rights, and when they're called into an internal interview, investigatory interview within their department, that they have some idea as to what the subject matter of the discussion is going to be, that they be afforded the right to have representation. We don't have in Wisconsin provisions in our collective bargaining agreements that impede an agency's ability to interview somebody, that that don't require an officer to cooperate with an investigation. I mean, obviously officers do have rights, but that hasn't been our experience, and that's a criticism I'm aware of, but it's not one that we've heard in Wisconsin. So I could respond to Rebecca's if she has some specific examples, but that just hasn't been the case in our state.
Becca Schimmel asked a general question. Do we need to make law enforcement more attractive, or is there an argument for taking some of the jobs off the hands of local law enforcement and transferring that into others who can provide different services, thereby, she says, reducing the need for the number of officers we believe we need today? That's a question to all of you.
All of the above.
Right.
I think that there are jobs. I remember when we had the tragedy in Dallas where the chief of police came out saying, here are police officers that are having to respond to a cat crawling up on the tree, and then all the way up from that to a rescue mission, right? So police officers are being asked to do things that I don't think that, back in the days in England, Robert Peel ever had those particular principles of policing in mind. Having said that, I think there are things that law enforcement can outsource to other entities, but I also believe that the job needs that we need to educate the public. I also think that training is not only for the officers, but we need to educate the public to understand that law enforcement as a profession is not to show cops for 30 minutes, right? Or that cops are not constantly, knocking people on the ground, that there is 80% paperwork. I mean, I've often called it in my books, 100 hours of boredom, 1 second of terror. And that's because of the fact that people don't realize the amount of bureaucracy, paperwork, politics that is involved in the profession, as opposed to what we see in movies and what we see in social media. So there needs to be, and we've done a really poor job, I think, in the past 20 years of educating the public as to what exactly are the realities of law enforcement, what are their limitations, what are their abilities, and how we can best respond to the law enforcement community.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I think that summed it up greatly. And the one thing I would say is that when we're considering, moving these things, shuffling these duties and things around, that we figure out to make sure that we can keep that personnel safe too, and that those personnel don't find themselves, they're not trained to deal with these situations that can escalate quickly. And sometimes it seems like there's no logic to it. And so I think it's important that we ensure that this personnel, that these people are safe. And so I know Dallas had a STARS team that they partnered with social workers and healthcare providers that I hadn't seen any research on it, but it seems like it was going well. I'm not sure with the funding, but I think it's utterly important that we don't sacrifice the safety of these parties who already are working hard, are underpaid as well, right? And put them in situations where they can be harmed or possibly even killed, or even the trauma from it, right? The mental health aspect of it. I think that's so important.
And I think within this context, if I may, we most recently have heard a lot about, having mental health professionals and social workers respond to certain calls for service. And I think that idea has merit. It's worth exploring. And the program, the Cahoots program out in Oregon is commonly held up as a model of this. But what is often overlooked is that the reason that those programs like the Cahoots program in Oregon are so successful is because they have a really robust mental health system throughout the state. They provide the aftercare. I mean, in Wisconsin, we can have a social worker or mental health professional respond to someone suffering a mental health crisis, but then if they have to be detained through an emergency detention and transported to a mental health facility, more than 90% of the agencies in Wisconsin have one mental health facility they have to transport those individuals to. So now you have somebody in crisis who has to spend 2, 3, 4, 5 hours just in road time to get to the facility, and that doesn't even, that doesn't even touch the admission process.
One of our,
To just piggyback on what Jim said, we've got to have great mental health wellness programs, or at least education on what officers can do to keep their brains and their bodies healthy before we can even look at other things along the road as well, since they are the first line of contact.
Someone has just pointed out that Rochester, Minnesota is opening up an emergency mental health center this June. Is that something, I'm not familiar with that, but is that something that you're familiar with? And are there any similar centers elsewhere? I'm not sure exactly what it does. The person who asked the question didn't say, but I assume it's just for like an ER where police can bring calls for service that involve mental health issues.
Yeah, it's great to know that they're going to open one. I was not aware of it, Steve, but I will tell you that many jurisdictions that I've worked with in the past, they do have designated hospitals that are particularly trained or have certain protocols in place in order to assist that officer coming in with a mental health patient. So I know that that's sort of an evolving component because it's cheaper to do that than it is to build an entire facility related to that. But I'm happy to hear that that's already starting in our country.
Someone is pushing back on the your almost unanimous dislike of qualified immunity, who asked, how does getting rid of qualified immunity harm public safety? What's the evidence for that?
Well, I mean, I think that there is something we call in statistics correlation, not necessarily causation, right? So I don't think that it causes that, but I think that it is highly correlated with the type of service that it may actually be provided if the profession becomes unattractive to individuals and it becomes harder to train. Look, we're having discussions right now all over the country about lowering the age to go into the police academy, what a prior drug offense is, at the time of the individual being hired. I am against all of those things, as you can imagine. I believe in my heart of hearts that you at the very least, you must be 21 years old, that you've got to have some degree of college education to be able to go into policing. I reside in the city of Arlington, Texas, where it's been a requirement for years to have a bachelor's degree to be a police officer. We have found that there's a correlation between that and less use of force in the streets. And so we know that education works. We know that all of these components work, but it's very difficult to remove that level of protection and still bring talented, educated individuals to the profession. That ultimately will affect the quality of service provided.
So the corollary question here is, how do you instill more accountability if you're not going to get rid of qualified immunity? That's the next question.
Hold the supervisors accountable for holding their people accountable. Don't just have nice policies in place that look nice to the naked eye. Be able to have the accountability component so that the training, the measurement of performance, the early warning systems, all of those things are working in conjunction with a strong leader that will not accept or allow for things such as racist police officers to occupy the ranks of law enforcement. That's what needs to happen, not on the front end to make the profession less attractive and more difficult to recruit good people.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I'll jump in and just maybe a different angle. We need data. You can't hold people accountable if we don't have data. And so, yeah, larger cities, they participate in as far as arrest data, right? But so many don't because it's a voluntary program, right? You have a use of force and all of these things. And so I believe in carrots and sticks, right? And so I believe that we can, if you talk about the federal government's role, those incentives, let's incentivize these agencies, maybe not sanction, but incentivize them, particularly smaller agencies that need money. They probably went to the 1033 program to get this military equipment. Perhaps we can incentivize them to be more transparent so we can not only hold them accountable, but see gaps where we can help them perform at the levels we want them to and they need to perform at. And so I would say that figuring out how to get more data and so we can look, it could be worse or better than we think, but we really just don't know.
Exactly. I think we've all talked at length about or acknowledged that, that the profession is suffering from some challenges that are only likely to get worse in terms of, there seems to be a growing shortage of people wanting to pursue law enforcement as a career, as a profession. I think you add into the dynamic that now we're going to judge officers based on the outcomes using hindsight and not relying on the information that they had available when they had to make a split-second life and death decision, which we obligate them to do. I think it would be absolutely devastating, and not only for public safety but for the officers and the profession. And I think that's not reimagining policing. I think that would be a nightmare kind of policing scenario.
We have about 6 minutes left. There's a couple other questions, but some of them have been already answered in effect by you guys. But I want to ask you to put your crystal ball hats on, if this is such a thing, and to look at policing 10 years from now. What do you think American policing will look like in 2030? I mean, assuming we're all still around, there's no climate change, we're not destroyed by war or whatever else, or another pandemic. What do you see the police person of the next decade look like? Maybe we'll start, Thaddeus, with you. You got the data on your side, so you can tell us where we're going.
So let me use the data and also the personal experience and anecdotal. If we can't make it attractive, if we can't recruit the right people, there's going to be a shortage and the police ranks will get thinner. And one thing we may have to rely on more is artificial intelligence. And that's scary because even with facial recognition technology, we know that it's, as far as identifying non-male white faces, it's less accurate. And nobody's really looking at if the influence of technology can exacerbate problems when we think it's a panacea, a magic bullet. And I hate to bust everybody's bubble. There's no such thing as a magic bullet. And so if that's the case, if we don't find ways to recruit and staff with the right people and train them and make it attractive, we will be relying on artificial intelligence, and that could be exacerbating issues for particular communities of color and poor communities.
We're actually having our last panel of the day today is going to be on technology and policing, so I hope you'll stick around for that. Sue, the police person of the future, should they have an MD or at least a master's in mental health next to their names?
No, they're just going to be all yogis and do No, in 10 years, I'm so hoping that there'll be some sort of more national standard on looking at the trauma of officers. And then also, what are some psychoeducation trainings that you can do to help with that? That doesn't involve taking meds and going to talk therapy, which most law enforcement officers don't want to do. So that would be my crystal ball view, at least hope, sending the good juju out there that would happen.
Jim, what will unions look like 10 years from now?
That's a great question. I think as far as the profession is concerned, I think it's likely that body cameras will be hopefully more universal in terms of their prevalence throughout the country. And I think it's likely we'll see more transparency within the hiring and disciplinary process over the course of the next decade. As far as what unions look like, that's a great question. And if I could answer it, I probably would be on a beach somewhere. But I think my hope is that law enforcement unions will take a more constructive role, and because I think they have such a great potential to be a partner and to be an advocate and a credible voice of reason. And I think that opportunity is largely being missed at present. And I hope that changes.
Alex, last word to you, the well-trained police officer 10 years from now. What's she going to look like?
I asked Herman Goldstein that question about 15 years ago, and he was prophetic in his response. This is, of course, the criminologist that is known to have been the creator of community policing. And his response to me 15 years ago was, Alex, every police department is going to have a data analyst. I would extend Dr. Goldstein's response and say the following. I believe that every police officer is going to be trained on capturing, understanding, and analyzing data. I think we're going to be very much a data-driven profession. It already is happening at different levels, but I think at the street level, instead of calling it a street-level bureaucrat or a street-level psychologist, we're going to have a street-level data-driven police officer. They're going to have to understand and own that data component to be able to do their job effectively.
Okay, so we're going to have to break it there, but I want to tell you, in this case, hold that thought because we're going to go next into our next area of policing. So if you guys stick around and listen to our next panel, we'll have other ideas. One of the things we didn't talk about was racism and racial issues and bias issues in policing. We left that purposely for among the issues that we're going to be talking about next. So we're going to take a brief 10-minute break, and then we'll come back right then. So see you in 10 minutes. Listen to the music, stretch your legs, and we'll be back soon.